The sheep moved like a single, patient body across the hillside, their hooves dull against the drying earth. Ethan Hale walked behind them with measured steps, his staff tapping the ground more out of habit than need. At 32, his life had narrowed into routines he could perform without thinking: wake before dawn, tend the flock, mend what broke, sleep beside a woman who no longer asked him how his day had been. The farm lay far from the road, tucked into a shallow valley where the wind carried sound away before it could linger. Ethan had chosen the place years ago because of that silence. Back then, quiet had felt like freedom. Now it pressed against him, thick and constant, filling the gaps where conversation used to live. Margaret hadn't come out with him that evening. She rarely did anymore. Her world had shifted inward: lists, schedules, phone calls that ended the moment he entered the room. Ethan told himself it was normal. Marriage, like land, settled over time. Still, as the sun lowered and stained the sky a tired orange, he felt the familiar weight in his chest, the sense that something unnamed was slowly being withheld from him. He was closing the gate when he noticed the boy. The figure stood near the fence line, thin against the open field, as if uncertain whether to approach or disappear. He couldn't have been more than 19. His jacket was too light for the cooling air, his backpack slung low and worn at the seams. When Ethan turned fully toward him, the boy flinched, then straightened, forcing himself to meet Ethan's gaze. "I'm sorry," the boy said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't mean to trespass." Ethan rested both hands on the gate. He was used to animals, not strangers. Especially not young ones with eyes that carried more caution than curiosity. "This is private land," he said, not unkindly. "I know." The boy hesitated, then took a step closer. "I was just passing through. I didn't think anyone would be out this far." The light was fading quickly now. Ethan studied him more carefully, the dirt under his nails, the bruise blooming faintly along his jaw, the way he stood as if prepared to run. Compassion stirred before caution could silence it. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Lucas. Lucas Reed." Ethan nodded once. "I'm Ethan." They stood there, the sheep murmuring softly behind him, the wind threading through the grass. Lucas shifted his weight, fingers tightening around the strap of his bag. "Can I sleep in your barn?" Lucas asked. The words came out in a rush, as if he feared reconsideration. "Just for the night. I'll be gone before morning." Ethan felt the question land heavier than it should have. He glanced toward the farmhouse, its windows already dark. Margaret would be inside, absorbed in her quiet distance, unaware that a choice was forming beyond the fence. He should say no. The rules of his life were built on saying no, no to deviation, no to risk, no to whatever this unsettled feeling was. Yet the boy's exhaustion was unmistakable, etched into his posture, his careful politeness. One night, Ethan said finally, "You stay in the barn. No funny business. You leave in the morning." Relief flickered across Lucas's face, quick and unguarded. "Thank you," he said. "I won't cause trouble. I promise." Ethan unlocked the side gate and led him across the yard. The barn smelled of hay and old wood, familiar and grounding. He showed Lucas a clear patch near the back, handed him a blanket without explanation. They spoke little after that. Words felt unnecessary, even risky. As Lucas settled in, Ethan lingered by the door. The lantern cast long shadows across the walls, stretching and distorting shapes he'd known his whole life. Lucas looked smaller here, folded inward, his defenses lowered by fatigue. "You'll be warm enough?" Ethan asked. Lucas nodded. "This is more than enough." Ethan turned away before he could say more. Outside, the night had fully settled, the sky dark and open. He walked back to the house with slow steps, aware of a restlessness he couldn't place. Later, lying beside Margaret's turned back, Ethan listened to the sounds of the farm, the distant sheep, the whisper of wind, the faint creak of the barn. Somewhere in that darkness, Lucas was breathing, trusting a stranger enough to sleep. Ethan closed his eyes, uneasy with the knowledge that nothing tangible had changed, and yet something already had. Morning arrived quietly, as it always did on the farm. Ethan rose before the sun, careful not to wake Margaret, whose sleep had grown light and restless in recent months. He dressed in the half-dark, pulling on familiar clothes with the ease of habit, yet his thoughts were already elsewhere. As he stepped outside, the cool air sharpened his senses, and his gaze drifted instinctively toward the barn. Lucas was already awake. He stood near the open door, brushing hay from his jacket, movements deliberate and restrained, as if unsure how much space he was allowed to occupy. When he noticed Ethan, he straightened at once. "Morning," Lucas said. Ethan nodded. "You didn't have to get up so early." Lucas shrugged. "Didn't feel right sleeping in." They walked toward the pasture together without planning it. Ethan handed Lucas a spare bucket, and Lucas accepted it without question, falling into step beside him. There was an awkwardness between them, not from discomfort but from attentiveness, as though both were aware of how easily silence could tip into something else. The sheep responded to Lucas with mild curiosity, crowding him until he laughed under his breath. The sound caught Ethan off guard. It was soft, unguarded, and quickly stifled, as if Lucas regretted letting it escape. "You ever done this kind of work?" Ethan asked. "Not really," Lucas said. "I move around, take whatever I can get." The answer held more than it explained. Ethan didn't press. He had learned that some truths came only when they were ready. They worked side by side through the morning, the rhythm of the chores steadying the space between them. Lucas watched Ethan closely, mirroring his movements, careful not to make mistakes. Once, when Lucas nearly lost his balance on the slope, Ethan reached out instinctively, steadying him by the arm. The contact was brief, necessary, and yet it lingered in Ethan's awareness long after they had separated. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the fields. Ethan brought out water and bread, and they sat on opposite sides of a wooden crate. Lucas ate slowly, as if unused to having enough. "My wife will be back later," Ethan said, surprising himself by saying it at all. "Margaret." Lucas looked up. "Oh, I didn't know you were married." Ethan nodded. The word felt heavier than it should have. "She's in town most days." "Work." Lucas lowered his gaze. "Then I won't stay long." Something in his tone, resigned, almost apologetic, tightened Ethan's chest. "You don't have to rush," he said, then stopped himself. "I mean, you'll leave when you're ready." Lucas offered a small smile, polite but distant, and the moment passed. In the afternoon, Margaret called. Her voice crackled faintly through the phone, brisk and distracted. She asked about supplies, reminded him about a repair he'd been meaning to do, then said she might stay overnight in town. Ethan answered where needed, listening more to what she didn't say than what she did. When the call ended, he stared at the blank screen longer than necessary. Lucas watched him from a few steps away. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Ethan said. The lie was automatic. "Everything's fine." They returned to work until the light softened again, the hours slipping by unnoticed. Lucas spoke a little more as the day wore on, about roads he'd taken, jobs he hadn't kept, places where no one remembered his name. He never mentioned family. Ethan sensed the absence like a missing note in a familiar tune. As evening approached, Lucas set the tools aside. "I should head out," he said. "Before it gets dark." Ethan felt the words before he understood them, a quiet resistance rising in him. The idea of the farm returning to its earlier silence unsettled him more than it should have. "You can stay another night," Ethan said. "If you want. There's no harm in it." Lucas searched his face, cautious again. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded, though his certainty wavered. "It's fine." Lucas exhaled slowly, relief softening his posture. "Thank you. Really." They stood there as dusk settled, the barn behind them, the house beyond. Ethan was acutely aware of the choice he'd made, not dramatic, not spoken aloud, yet deliberate all the same. That night, as Ethan lay awake listening to the wind move through the valley, he realized he was waiting for something he could not name. And somewhere in the barn, Lucas slept again, closer than a stranger should be, close enough to make the quiet feel charged instead of empty. The storm arrived without ceremony, a low gathering of clouds that swallowed the hills and pressed the air flat. Ethan noticed it first by the way the sheep clustered tighter than usual, their unease spreading through the pasture like a ripple. By the time the first drops fell, heavy and deliberate, the sky had darkened to a bruised gray. Lucas was still outside, hauling feed toward the barn. Ethan called out to him, his voice raised over the wind. "Leave it. Come in." They made it under the barn's roof just as the rain turned sharp, drumming against the tin in uneven bursts. Ethan shut the door and slid the bolt into place, sealing them inside the dim interior. The sudden closeness felt different now, amplified by the storm. The world narrowed to wood, hay, and the sound of rain. The power flickered once, then died. The barn sank into near darkness. Ethan swore softly and reached for the lantern hanging by the wall. Its glow was small but steady, casting a warm circle that barely touched the corners. Shadows pulled around them, making the space feel both intimate and uncertain. Lucas laughed under his breath, more from nerves than humor. Guess I picked the wrong time to leave. You can't, Ethan said. Not in this. Lucas nodded, rubbing his hands together. The temperature had dropped quickly, the damp air seeping into everything. Without thinking, Ethan handed him the heavier jacket he'd been wearing. Lucas hesitated. I'm fine. Take it, Ethan said. You're not. Lucas accepted it, pulling it on with care, as if the weight of it carried meaning beyond warmth. Thanks. They sat on opposite sides of a bale of hay, the lantern between them. The rain settled into a steady rhythm, relentless but distant. For a while, neither spoke. Silence no longer felt empty here, it felt expectant. I don't usually stay places like this, Lucas said suddenly. Not more than a night. Ethan looked at him. Why? Lucas shrugged, eyes fixed on the lantern flame. People get uncomfortable. Or I do. Ethan understood more than he wanted to admit. You make people nervous. Lucas smiled faintly. Something like that. The light caught the edge of Lucas's face, highlighting the bruise that had faded but not disappeared. Ethan found himself watching the rise and fall of Lucas's breath, the way he held himself as if braced for judgment. You don't have to explain yourself, Ethan said. Lucas's shoulders loosened, just slightly. I know, but it's rare when someone doesn't ask. The confession lingered between them. Ethan felt a familiar pull, an urge to step closer, to bridge the small but deliberate space he'd been maintaining. He resisted it, shifting his weight instead. My wife doesn't ask much anymore either, Ethan said, the words leaving him before he could weigh them. Lucas looked up, surprised. I'm sorry. Ethan shook his head. It's not your fault. They fell quiet again. The storm raged on, isolating the barn from the rest of the world. Time seemed suspended, measured only by the lantern's flicker. Lucas broke the silence with a softer voice. Do you ever feel like you're invisible to the person who's supposed to see you the most? The question struck with uncomfortable precision. Ethan's answer came slower, heavier. Yes. Lucas met his gaze then, really met it, and for a moment neither looked away. The awareness between them sharpened, no longer vague or distant. Ethan felt it in his chest, a tightening that carried both longing and warning. Lucas stood abruptly, pacing a few steps as if to shake something loose. I should sleep, he said. Storm or not, I don't want to be a problem. You're not, Ethan said, rising as well. They stood too close now. The lantern cast their shadows together on the wall, indistinct where one ended and the other began. Lucas's breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. I don't mean to, Lucas began, then stopped. Ethan should have stepped back. Instead, he stayed where he was. Lucas reached out, hesitant, his fingers brushing Ethan's sleeve, a question more than a touch. Ethan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, the weight of his marriage, his rules, his careful life pressing in on him. When he opened them, he did not move away. The kiss was brief, uncertain, and quiet, as if the barn itself were listening. It held no urgency, only acknowledgement. And yet, when they parted, the space between them felt irrevocably altered. Ethan stepped back first, guilt crashing in as swiftly as the storm outside. This can't happen, he said, his voice unsteady. Lucas nodded, color draining from his face. I know. They separated, retreating to opposite ends of the barn. The lantern flickered, steady but dim, illuminating the cost of what had just occurred. As the rain continued to fall, Ethan understood that restraint had finally given way to truth, and that nothing, no matter how quiet or brief, could return things to how they had been before. Morning came pale and uncertain, the storm having passed in the night and left the valley washed clean. Ethan woke before the sheep stirred, the events of the evening replaying with unwelcome clarity. The barn stood quiet across the yard, unchanged in shape yet altered in meaning. He dressed slowly, as if haste might force him to confront what he was not yet ready to name. Lucas was awake when Ethan entered the barn. He sat on the edge of the hay, jacket folded neatly beside him, his posture closed and careful. Whatever ease had settled between them before was gone, replaced by a distance that felt deliberate. We should talk, Ethan said, though the words sounded thin. Lucas nodded once. I was going to leave early. You don't have to run, Ethan replied, then paused. But you do have to go. Lucas absorbed this without protest. I know. They stood in the quiet, the morning light filtering through the slats and breaking into narrow bands across the floor. Ethan searched for the right explanation, something that might soften the finality of what he was asking. None came. What happened last night, Ethan said carefully, can't happen again. Lucas's mouth tightened, but his voice remained steady. I didn't expect it to. The restraint in his tone cut deeper than anger would have. Ethan felt the full weight of his decision settle into place, heavy and unavoidable. I'm married, he added, as if the word might still carry authority. Lucas looked up then, meeting his eyes. I didn't forget. Silence returned, thicker than before. Ethan turned away, busying himself with unnecessary tasks, checking a latch, straightening tools, anything to avoid standing still. He heard Lucas gather his things behind him, the soft rustle of fabric and footsteps deliberate in their slowness. By the time Lucas reached the door, Ethan had run out of reasons to delay. He faced him again, aware of how little space remained between them, both physical and emotional. You'll find your way, Ethan said. It sounded like hope, though he wasn't sure for whom. Lucas slung the backpack over his shoulder. I always do. He hesitated, as if considering something unsaid, then shook his head slightly. Thank you, he added. For the night. Ethan nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. Lucas stepped outside into the early light and walked down the narrow path without looking back. Ethan watched until the figure dissolved into the landscape, until the valley reclaimed its familiar stillness. Later that morning, Margaret returned. Her arrival was unremarkable, tires on gravel, the sound of a door closing, but Ethan felt it like a dividing line. She moved through the house with practiced efficiency, asking about the sheep, the storm, the broken fence near the south field. Ethan answered where required, his responses precise and distant. You seem tired, Margaret observed, setting her bag down. Long night, Ethan said. She nodded, already distracted, and the conversation drifted into silence. Watching her move about the kitchen, Ethan saw their life with new clarity, not broken, but hollowed by habit and neglect. The realization did not bring relief, only a quiet grief. Days passed. The farm returned to its routines, but the quiet no longer felt neutral. It carried echoes, Lucas's cautious smile, the question in his eyes, the moment when restraint had failed. Ethan replayed it all while working, while eating, while lying beside Margaret in the dark, aware of how easily lines could be crossed and how costly that crossing could be. Weeks later, Ethan found himself standing in the barn again, alone. Dust motes floated in the slanted light, settling where Lucas had once slept. The space felt larger now, emptier. He thought of the question Lucas had asked on the first night, the simple vulnerability of it. Can I sleep in your barn? At the time, it had seemed small, inconsequential. Now he understood it for what it was, an invitation, not just to shelter, but to connection. Ethan closed the barn door and rested his forehead against the wood. He did not know what future awaited him, whether his marriage would endure or quietly erode. He only knew that something essential had been exposed, and once seen, it could not be unseen. As he walked back toward the house, the valley stretched wide and silent before him. Life would continue, shaped by choices made in moments of quiet weakness. And somewhere beyond the hills, Lucas was moving forward too, carrying with him a fragment of a night that had altered them both, brief and irrevocable.